In a city where power is traded in whispers and loyalty is a currency with an expiration date, one crash shatters the illusion of safety and exposes the fault lines running beneath polished lives. This piece dives beneath the sirens and shattered glass to chart the bruised psyches of three people bound by a single engineered moment, a victim learning to weaponize patience, a conspirator suffocating under the weight of her own design, and a silent opportunist turning secrets into leverage. Through simmering anger, private bargains, and the calculus of survival, their choices spiral into a struggle where truth is never pure and victory is never clean. What begins as a tragic accident mutates into a cold war of evidence and intent, a contest of will in which every apology is a strategy, every kindness a trap, and every heartbeat a countdown. Andre's accident was not a coincidence, and the naked truth of that fact fractured every moral mask people clung to like a coat of paint hiding flaws. With the streetlights still slick with rain, the car veered into the median as if pulled off course by an invisible hand, metal grinding against concrete and making the willow trees tremble like a long, low moan. Andre lay motionless in the wreckage, his breathing cut into sharp, staccato pieces, while the onlookers could only react with fear and pity. But behind the white dust of the deployed airbag, there was another gaze, another heartbeat, a calculating mind counting the beats of opportunity. Hayley stood there with hands trembling just enough to avoid suspicion, eyes misty just enough to earn an embrace, and a plan arranged piece by piece like stones stacked to dam a river before the flood. She had tampered with the braking system, choosing the right time, the right incline, the precise moment when Andre believed life had been peaceful long enough to let his guard down. Her coldness hid behind gestures of care, and when the ambulance siren tore through the night, she silently tallied how many next steps still had to be cleared, how many polite inquiries she needed to send, how many faces she would have to smile at to keep the tale of a tragic, sudden mishap alive. Randy knew. He knew about the night Hayley invented an excuse to slip out, about the cryptic call to a mechanic willing to sell his integrity for a heavy envelope, about the messages deleted in haste but preserved by the system's memory, about the parking lot camera masked with a sheet of transparent tape that looked harmless. Randy chose silence, not out of fear but out of the old habit of someone who understands the weight of information. His silence wasn't a void, it was a vault waiting for the day the lid would open. He collected clues the way a financier accumulates certificates, the way a negotiator amasses shares at a bargaining table, knowing that at the right moment they would force someone to sign terms they could not refuse. Within that silence, Randy nurtured a different wrath, not explosive, not volcanic, but osmotic, slowly eroding pride with meticulous restraint. He measured Hayley the way he would track the volatility of a fledgling stock, high risk, tempting yield, with a hand perpetually poised on the emergency brake if the curve began to skid. Andre was no longer merely a victim on a hospital bed. The throbbing pain in his fractured ribs came in waves against stone, each pulse a shard of memory ricocheting off another at odd angles. He pieced together the final frames before impact, a car behind him suddenly changing lanes, a figure at the corner of the intersection, a brake light that felt strangled underfoot, a faint clicking rising from the pedal. When he woke, the faces at his bedside organized themselves into tiers of unconscious priority. Some came with perfume too strong, questions too concise, a handshake too tight, a stare too still. Andre was not naturally suspicious, but pain sharpens instinct in its own way. Every step in physical therapy became both a physical trial and an exercise in sifting trust. He remembered recent arguments pushed too far, plans derailed at the last minute as if a puppeteer had cut the strings, ledger entries labeled operational that disguised strange transfers, and Randy materializing with offers of help too swift, too perfectly timed. His anger didn't burst into shouting, it seeped into the way he watched, the way he held his tongue when others believed they controlled the narrative, the way he arranged his questions on an internal chessboard waiting for the decisive move. In the first days after the accident, Hayley constructed the image of a woman exhausted by trauma, ever present at the hospital, careful with every medical answer, living by a meticulous task list like a talisman. She texted Andre's relatives, sent brisk condition updates, wore the costume of a silent caregiver. But the more she acted, the more she heard another ticking inside, not from the brake pedal this time, but from a door of conscience left slightly ajar. Each time she saw Andre try to lift an arm, each time she heard his restrained sigh, a tiny needle pierced the calm sheath she wore. She smothered the sting with logic. This was a necessary step to remove an operational obstacle, to protect a calculated future, to punish a betrayal that only she knew in full. She told herself that if she hadn't acted decisively, someone else would have, that the tide had shoved her forward, that pressing down on the fatal brake was merely a way to straighten the wheels. But new variables pressed back: an insurance investigator more persistent than expected, a preliminary technical report noting suspicious interference, a garage worker quitting and vanishing without a trace, and above all, Randy's silence that had grown too smooth. Randy began to set conditions without words. He appeared when needed, vanished on cue, leaving behind the aftertaste of help that couldn't be grasped. He suggested steps for Hayley, reworking schedules to avoid overlaps with recorded times, steering her toward a new technical supplier, gently mentioning a contingency fund that could flatten legal noise. Each suggestion hit a cord looped around Hayley's wrist, and each nod tightened the noose. Randy didn't need to say the truth about the brakes. He only had to make Hayley understand that control of the story had fallen into a locked drawer with the key in his pocket. His anger pointed backward to the years when he'd been ranked as the weaker party, the one sent to put out fires rather than design the building. In his eyes, Andre's accident was the chance to redraw the balance of power, to force people into invisible contracts whose principal clause demanded permanent silence in exchange for survival. The true storm began when the insurance investigator arrived with a list of questions about the brakes and maintenance schedule. Hayley understood that a single unconvincing answer could trigger an independent examination, and then the splices and covers laid over with fresh lubricant would lie under the unforgiving white of a lab's fluorescent lights. She stood between two fires: the fear of revelation, dragging reputational ruin and criminal liability, and the clear gaze of a recovering Andre, stripping her mask layer by layer. She chose preemptive defense, seeding rumors that a rival had sabotaged the car, weaving a story about faulty manufacturer parts recalled abroad, fabricating a trail of emails that suggested a scheduled replacement delayed by circumstance. She tightened the protective net with data, messages, and invoices, hoping to turn deliberate malice into systemic error. But perfection bred an anomaly. The more details she added, the higher the probability of internal contradictions, and the investigator flagged several misaligned timestamps. Meanwhile, Andre began to test loyalties. He noted who avoided his eyes when he mentioned the car, who changed the subject when he spoke of postponed projects, who recited the contents of a phone call from the night of the crash with suspicious precision. He watched how Hayley's breathing changed when a nurse brought in an envelope from the insurer, how Randy left the room more quickly than usual when his phone buzzed from an unnamed number. He didn't need a confession, he needed patterns that repeated. When he had enough, the steady anger inside him found direction, not in cathartic outburst, but in quiet restructuring of power. Andre demanded a full extraction of vehicle data from the black box, requested a neutral examiner, saw traffic cameras from the week before the crash to learn if he'd been followed, and asked IT to audit internal network access around vehicle maintenance scheduling. Each lawful request was a cut through Hayley's fabricated mesh, and she understood that one slice landing true could collapse the whole weave. Tension peaked when Randy pushed a final offer: he would handle the investigator for a fee, the universal hush charge, if Hayley ceded decision-making in a strategic project she currently controlled. This was no longer suggestion, it was an unsigned contract, a down payment made with secrets. Hayley stood before a scale where the difference in weight was nearly invisible. Refuse, and Randy might lift the vault's lid; accept, and she would take another turn in the labyrinth of dependency, converting Andre's accident from a private sin into collateral for the long term. She recognized that she had driven a man against a wall only to be pressed by another. For the first time since that rainy night, she saw herself not as a player but as a piece being pried off the board. From the outside, others began to sense the oddness. Meetings were shuffled with force majeure explanations, mid-level staff received contradictory emails on maintenance protocols, certain partners fielded verification calls about parts supply. The atmosphere shifted color, every pleasantry gained a probing undertone, every corporate smile sprouted a hidden edge. People who once stood neutral started choosing sides by reflex. This was no longer a morality tale about three people, it had become an architectural drawing of power: multiple pylons, pre-dug escape tunnels. At the center, Andre made his move that needed to be made. He allowed a controlled leak about commissioning an independent brake analysis, a signal calibrated to force dirty hands to flinch. As the news spread, the long-missing mechanic who'd taken an envelope resurfaced in a roadside bar, and the question of his involvement turned into fresh tinder. Hayley came home on a rainless night, saw her reflection in the glass, and recognized two images superimposed: the woman who once believed herself cold enough to manage every variable, and the captive being strangled by her own fear until all sense of direction was lost. She considered confessing, then shattered the thought with the terror of losing everything. She considered pinning blame on a rival, then saw how every leap in the mud only splattered more filth. She considered a deeper pact with Randy, then recoiled at the future in which she would be hostage to her own act. She began to understand that Andre's strategy targeted not merely technical truth but the very pulse of relationships. He was making every link re-examine itself and seek an exit, and in that scramble the retellings would accidentally outline the shape of the hand that once touched the fatal break. Randy stayed up late, staring at spreadsheets and relationship maps, calculating when to trigger his contingency. He could expose part of the evidence to gut Hayley's credibility and seize control of the strategic project, but that would torch an asset meant to last. He could maneuver the investigator through intermediaries, but that would drag him deeper into a darkness that might someday testify against him. He could approach Andre and bargain to bury the truth in exchange for a counterfeit stability, but that would turn a sharpening adversary into a permanent contemner. Each option was a knife angled back toward his own ribs, and though Randy was used to playing with blades, he felt his hand go cold. The anger he had banked for years was no longer pure propulsion, it had thickened into a night weight that kept him from sleep, whispering that tactical victories become strategic debts if the opponent still stands. Andre looked out over the city from the hospital window as night thinned, and a strange clarity threaded itself between the pulses of pain. He knew that justice doesn't arrive trumpeted and gilded, it is built by placing small stones exactly where they belong and waiting for the tide to recede to reveal the gravel bed. He wasn't seeking the short-lived pleasure of a public confession, he wanted to reset the axis so no one could use his accident as capital in a private game. He had petitioned the court to preserve evidence, hired independent experts to relink the data chain, arranged a meeting with a silent shareholder long disgruntled by Randy's manipulations. He let anger become discipline, let betrayal harden into design. He prepared for the worst case, too, that the truth might not be strong enough to shatter every shell, only enough to loosen a few pillars. If that happened, he would not try to rebuild the old house, he would construct a new one somewhere hands that tamper with brakes couldn't reach. As the sun lifted at the edge of the horizon, 3 people were awake, each holding a shard of truth, each imprisoned in a room of their own making. Hayley was cornered by camouflage woven too tightly, she knew any move now would make a sound loud enough for someone to turn their head. Randy was cornered by the vault he had once prized, every chest inside it was a mine, and the path past them narrowed with each step. Andre was cornered by flesh and time, if he moved too slowly, tracks would fade, too quickly and the structure would fail. All faced a new day that promised no comfort. It demanded a choice. Hayley had to choose whether to admit a fraction to limit the blast radius or keep sprinkling dust until she choked. Randy had to choose whether to spark detonation for immediate seizure or leave the mines intact and keep ruling by threat, accepting the risk of a stray spark. Andre had to choose whether to swing hard for catharsis or snip chords in rhythm until the enemy hung by their own knots. In the brief stillness before the next move, their anger reached its purest form. No more ornate justifications, no more gestures borrowed from morality for cover, only raw forces colliding like cold metal hammered again and again. That anger would set the course, to burn everything to ash, or to reforge it into something harder, colder, less forgiving. The accident was only the opening shot, the real play was always written in the dark by hands that tremble but refuse to release, by cool heads converting fear into leverage, by hearts betrayed learning to beat on time with reason. And as the next moves began, none of them could claim innocence. Each had touched the brake on another life in one way or another. Whatever the outcome, the tiny click of that night would echo for a long time in all their memories, a reminder that one decision in the rain can become a sentence that outlasts many summers of sun. In the end, nothing explodes, at least not in ways that satisfy the appetite for spectacle. Instead, consequences arrive like winter, incremental, undeniable, and colder than anyone imagined. The investigation refuses to die, feeding on inconsistencies until it grows teeth, the mechanic's shadow lengthens, the paper trail acquires a rhythm that no alibi can mute. Hayley, once the architect of momentum, becomes its captive, spending her nights bargaining with dread and her days rearranging sandbags against a tide she summoned. Randy discovers that leverage is a wasting asset, every secret he hoards corrodes the hand that holds it, every contingency hedged becomes a corridor narrowing toward a door he may not fit through. And Andre, scarred but lucid, learns the hard craft of patient force, how to set a system of weights and let gravity do the quiet work of judgment. No confession grants absolution, no victory tastes sweet. But a new alignment takes shape, built less on trust than on verified constraints, less on declarations than on audited facts. The city keeps shining as if none of it matters, meetings start on time, elevators hum. Yet beneath the polished schedule, everyone walks a fraction slower, turning once more at every threshold, aware that control is not a crown but a loan, and that the pendulum always remembers. If there is grace here, it is the austere kind, 3 lives that have looked into the engine of harm and must now live with the knowledge of how easily it starts.